I want to talk to you briefly about two constructs, reliability and validity. These aren't difficult to understand, and for some reason people get them mixed up all the time. So let me talk you through it. First of all, reliability is exactly what it sounds like, the way we would use the word in everyday language. It means that something is consistent. So if I've got a target and I'm shooting arrows at it, a pattern like this shows that I'm consistent. I'm right towards the middle, but off to the right. But all my arrows are going in roughly the same spot, so it's reliable. I'm a reliable shooter. I'm consistent. As opposed to a target where they're just all over the place. This is not a consistent or reliable shooter. So how does this relate to research? If we want our research to be consistent, it has to stay the same. The tool that we're wanting to use to measure something has to be reliable or consistent. So if I've got a group of kids and I give them a test, and these are their scores on the test, if that test is reliable, the next time I give them the same test, they would score about the same. That means that the tool I'm using is consistent. That test is reliable. As opposed to a test like this where they don't score anywhere close to what they did originally on the first test. So this is not reliable. This instrument would not be reliable. There are many ways that we use this in the world. One example is hospitals measure the reliability of their procedures with numbers. So in hospital A, 90% of the patients get their antibiotics within 30 minutes of surgery finishing up. And in the next hospital, only 65% of the patients get antibiotics within 30 minutes of surgery. This is a tool that's used by hospital administration to see whether their procedures are reliable. This is how they measure them. Another example, I grew up in a figure skating country. We have what we call inter-rater reliability. And that means, are the judges consistent? At one point, I was publishing a paper with a colleague, and we were assigning a rating or numbers to the characteristics of what we were examining. We spent literally probably 40 hours together rating these side by side until we came to enough agreement that we could then split up and do the work on our own and independently. But our inter-rater reliability was up over 90%, which is great. It means that we were both using the instrument the same way and rating what we were measuring. It's a kind of a silly example, but if you were sick and taking your temperature, you'd be a little frustrated if your thermometer, using it 3 times, it gave you 3 different temperatures. That's not a reliable thermometer, and that's what we want, is reliable measurements. Reliability is assigned a number. It's measured between 0, which means it's not reliable at all, to 1, which means perfect reliability. And what this does is it measures the strength of the relationship between either the first test and the second test or 2 different tests. So reliability is given a number. Now let's switch to validity. Validity means that it measures what it claims to. It's valid. You've heard people say, well, that's a valid argument. In other words, what you've said applies and can be used. It's like you're saying that you're using the right tool for the job. So this fellow with his bicycle pump is obviously using the wrong tool. It's not a valid tool for the task that he has. Going back to the target example, if this is my goal, I want, if I've got a valid shooter or a valid instrument, I want my arrows to fall in close to that goal. So let's go through some examples. If I've got an instrument that measures how students, third graders do, how much their reading improves. I've got some kind of instrument that measures that at the end of the year. And so I can get scores for each student. And over time, if consistently it's reliable and I get these scores and this tool has been validated, then I can start to make some interesting observations. I might know that the average gain by third graders in our state perhaps is 8. And so that lets me look at my different students and use the tool use the tool validly. Is that a word? It's relevant. It's measuring what it claims, and so I can have confidence in it. Now, when we run into problems is when we say, oh, the average gain by third graders is 8. So I'm going to say that this student is gifted and this one has ADHD. That's not a valid use of the tool. All this tool measured was their change in reading skills of some kind. It isn't a valid measurement of whether a student is gifted or whether a student has another situation going on. It's back to my silly example. If you've got flu symptoms, the doctor is not going to measure or send you for an x-ray on your foot. Now, looking at the ACT score, let's use that as another example. Over time, over years and years and years, and literally hundreds of thousands of teenagers taking this test, they can say that the ACT is a valid measure of how students will do. It's predictive of how they will do in their freshman classes. So if a student scores at least an 18 on the English part of the ACT, that student has a 50% likelihood of getting a B or better in freshman English. And that's been validated over many, many years and hundreds of thousands of students. So this is why colleges rely on a valid instrument like this. So validity measures what it claims to, but it has no numerical label. It isn't measured between 0 and some number the way that reliability is. Instead, validity relies on an expert judgment. And it's usually classified as highly valid or generally invalid. And so this takes content experts to look at the actual tool that's being used to measure something and decide how valid it is. Over time, you can come up with predictive validity, and that's like the example of the ACT test that I've given. We can be pretty confident in its predictive ability. Many of you probably took the GRE before you got into grad school. It's been validated over literally hundreds of thousands of graduate students. And then last of all, there's validity that comes when 2 different tests are given, or if we use a proxy, and this is concurrent validity. So for example, it's really, really tough to measure poverty in children in schools. I mean, you've got a poverty level you could measure against, but it's not really the children, it's their parents, it's their home. So what we do is we use a valid concurrent situation or a valid proxy. And in this case, in a lot of research that you'll see, we use the number of students who get a free or reduced cost lunch at school. I got caught once presenting to a business community not at all familiar with the education world. And somebody said, what do you mean free and reduced lunch? Some kids, just because they're poor, they get a reduced lunch. So I learned to be very careful with the construct and how I talked about it. Now let me give you some cautions about these two words. First of all, they both relate to the instruments being used to measure something. And it's their use that you want to look at. Is it a valid use? Is it reliable and consistent? Now, you cannot have a valid result without some reliability. So think back to the target. If the arrows were all over the place and it was inconsistent, there's no way I'm hitting the goal and it's going to tell me anything useful. So it wouldn't be valid either. But just because something is reliable doesn't mean it's valid. And it's sometimes hard to find this information in research. The researchers often make assumptions about their readers, or they have space limitations, and so you have to kind of dig for it and look for it. But it's something that should be addressed when you're looking at the usefulness of the measurements being used to collect data. So in the article about effects of trauma research on participants, in the procedures part and the measures in particular, all the author put was that all participants completed the self-assessment mannequin, SAM, and then there's references given there. A 2-item picture measure in which, and goes on to explain this measurement, the SAM has been used previously to track emotional reactions to stimuli, and then a reference is given. So the authors have let us know where we can go to find more information on the validity and the reliability of this instrument that they're using. So to wrap up quickly, this is all about asking the question, how good are the tools that are being used to collect the data? Is this tool reliable and consistent? And is it valid for the way that it's being used so that the results I'm getting, it's an appropriate measure for the results that I say that I'm getting?